The Challenge of Living in the World as a Theosophist, a lecture by Helen B. Author and developmental psychologist, she has served the Theosophical Society in many capacities, including manager of Camp Indralaya, a camp offering workshops on theosophical and allied subjects.
It is a pleasure to be here. This is in fact the first time that I have been here as a speaker. I have sat in that audience any number of times, but this is the first time I've had a chance to stand up here and talk a bit. And I come not in my role as developmental psychologist, and really not as an expert on ethics, because that's not my field, but as a fellow seeker, as a person like all of you. You wouldn't be here if you weren't concerned with the question that I want to talk about tonight, which is how one goes about living the life of a theosophist. Many of you, I understand, have been in this room many times, and you've undoubtedly heard lots of talks on various aspects of the theosophical worldview, or many of the concepts that you will find in the theosophical teachings. Reincarnation, karma, evolution. I guess John Algeo was here just a few days ago talking about reincarnation. It's very easy, if you go to any branch around the country, and there's much discussion about those same concepts, to come away with the sense that theosophy is entirely an intellectual exercise, and it is not at all that. It is not, I misstate, it is not that it is not intellectual, it has that aspect, but that is not all of it. And my burning concern, really for at least the past 10 years, and certainly beyond that to perhaps a lesser extent, has been the question of how I apply this philosophy, this way of thinking, this set of assumptions to my everyday life. Perhaps that is a middle-aged set of questions, I don't know. Perhaps when you're younger you simply live, and you come to middle age and you begin to question all kinds of things. Certainly for me it was a sort of mid-30s set of issues. You know, how do I do this? What does it mean in an everyday sense? And of course, within the theosophical literature, there are many, many, many references to the fact that to be a theosophist, it is not enough merely to read and study, that the living of the life is as essential. Madame Blavatsky said in The Secret Doctrine, which, as I think many of you know, is one of the central texts of the Theosophical teachings, and I quote, "Live the life if you would come to the wisdom. Live the life if you would come to the wisdom." A profound statement, and one I want to come back to at the end, because I think it has some interesting implications. She says also in The Key to Theosophy, another one of her major writings, "Theosophy is who theosophy does." Well, that's all very nice to say, you know, live the life. But what does that mean? What is it to live the life? How does that get me through the day? How does it help me make decisions like whether to be a vegetarian or not, which I have in fact been all my life, but there were certainly moments when I went back and questioned that again. How does one decide those things? On what basis does one decide things as concrete as that? Many of us, I think, have looked at issues of self-sacrifice as perhaps being among the prescriptions for a theosophical life, the selfless pursuit of compassionate caring for others. Well, but that's, you know, it's a great deal easier said than done, as you all know. But there are all kinds of questions. Every time any group I have been in has discussed the whole issue of selflessness, half the women in the room get furious, because they say our culture has told women all these generations now to be selfless and give of themselves to others and put others first. And I've had enough, thank you, they say. Where is the chance for me to develop myself as well? Isn't that simply a prescription for martyrdom? How does one tell the difference between selflessness and martyrdom? How does one decide these things in an ordinary sense? And it has been that set of questions that has pursued me. Last March, when I was at the Crotona School of Theosophy, I gave an evening presentation on this same subject at the Crotona branch of the Society. And many of the people there don't like these kinds of evenings, but I made them do it anyway. After a brief introduction, they thought I was going to give a nice lecture and that they could all sit there while I gave them the answer. Nope. So I talked for about 5 minutes, and then I said, okay, I don't know what theosophical ethics is. Why don't you tell me? And I made them all break up into little groups of 2, pairs, I guess you could say that is, rather than a group, and write each pair a definition of theosophical ethics. And let me read to you some of the answers that they came to. This is not a simple question, as you will see, and there's an interesting variety of answers to this question from among a group of people, many of whom have been Theosophists for 40 and 50 years or longer. Let me just, these are in a particular order. There's a message in here. 3 words: generosity, humility, and strength or courage. Actually, that's 4 words, but second one: to be ethical is always to be true, kind, and helpful. Theosophical ethics, as distinct from conventional religious ethics, revolves around the practice of harmlessness, tolerance, and unity. Now, all 3 of those are quite, and as such things go, are quite specific. They are what I would call prescriptive definitions. They say, here is what to do or be. Now, they don't say, how to be tolerant, but certainly they make a list. It's sort of like a theosophical version of the 10 Commandments. Much to be said for that. Number 4, respect for all sentient beings and the will to feel their joys and sorrow as if they were our own. That's a little less prescriptive. Theosophical ethics is that way of life of which every thought, feeling, and act promotes the spiritual upliftment of mankind. That's a lovely sentence, but it doesn't tell you very much about how to live on a day-to-day basis. It's a lovely sentence, however. A selfless, compassionate living out of one's deeper nature, which arises out of a realization that one's own nature is rooted in the divine nature of all. Also a lovely statement. And finally, the least prescriptive, the most relative statement of all. Theosophical ethics derives from our true spiritual nature and is unique to each according to the level of spiritual awareness that has been achieved. Now that statement is clear at the other end of the spectrum. Let me read that one to you again. Theosophical ethics derives from our true spiritual nature and is unique to each according to the level of spiritual awareness that has been achieved. That one says, there is nothing specific I can tell you. Each person must arrive at his or her own ethical life. There is no such thing as a prescription of how to live that will be, quote, a theosophical life. So you have everything there from soup to nuts, everything from a fairly specific set of rules to live by to a very relativist position. Now, my own earlier explorations, what I want to do is to explore each of those ends and see where each one takes us. To start with the prescriptive and see where that leads, and then go to a more relativist notion and see where that leads us, and see if there's any kind of resolution of those two, which, because I've been wrestling with exactly this dichotomy for at least 10 years now. My own personal instinct is to want someone to give me the rules. And I started out saying, okay, how do you do this? Give me the rules. What do I have to do? And in the Theosophical branch in Seattle, where I was then a member, I, full of enthusiasm, agreed to do a once-a-month discussion series on Theosophical ethics. I figured there's nothing like forcing yourself to teach it to make you learn something. So I started reading, and the book that influenced me perhaps more than any other is a small book that many of you may have read called At the Feet of the Master, of which I happen to have a copy, which I rushed over this. I couldn't find my copy. I must have given away 15 of these in the course of the years. Couldn't find my copy, so I rushed over to the bookstore to buy one. It was written by Krishnamurti in his very early years as a reflection of the teachings that he had been receiving. And this is a wonderful book for a person who wants a nice prescriptive detail about how to live a theosophical life. And it says, for example, it lists as the qualifications for the path of enlightenment: discrimination, which has to do with knowing what is right and doing it, not a simple matter. That's not so easy to do. Desirelessness, also not a simple matter, but at least fairly clear. And he talks at some length in there about avoiding meddling. A nice specific thing that I just loved. I thought, boy, if I can just stop meddling, then I'm getting somewhere. Good conduct, which includes a number of elements: self-control of both mind and action, tolerance, cheerfulness. He says quite explicitly, depression is wrong. This always leads to wonderful discussions when you take up such questions, because people, what do you mean it's wrong to be depressed? I have a perfect right to be depressed anytime I want. And here it says, right in black and white in this little book, it's immoral to be depressed. And that raises some very interesting questions. One-pointedness, my apologies for my awful handwriting, and confidence. I should have started smaller. And then the last of the four big ones is love. And he says, you can have all the rest, and if you don't have love, it doesn't matter a bit. And included in love, he talks at great length about avoiding three things that he specifically says are evil: gossip, cruelty, and superstition. We have had wonderful discussions about gossip and why gossip is immoral or sinful or wrong or whatever, unethical, whatever word you wish to use. This was about as concrete as I found it. And in the course of our discussions, I will try to write, Well, you're going to have to practice here, looking through the previous writing. We evolved, in the course of these monthly discussions, a sort of outline that seemed to work. And on one side, we had what we called positive facets, and then we had lots of arguments about whether it was reasonable to do this, but then on the other side we put negative ones. On the bottom side we put negative. We changed our mind about that, but... And then we had a bunch of columns here. Wait a minute, I gotta get a little... This was the biggest blackboard they said they had, so bear with me. Okay, one of the things that I was very concerned about, that it seems to me is absolutely central to any kind of understanding of this kind of prescriptive theosophical ethics, is the awareness, which is very much part of the model of the nature of man, that is part of the theosophical model, is that each of us exists simultaneously on many levels. That the thought and the emotion is just as real, just as influential, if not more so, than action. So that in order to understand oneself, in order to understand ethical behavior, in order to understand how to live a theosophically ethical life, one has to think not just about what one does, but what one thinks and how one feels. And that makes the task infinitely more difficult. It is not enough just to do no wrong or to do kind things, but one must also feel kind in the process. So we ended up with mental, emotional, and physical or behavioral. You can tell I'm a psychologist, can't you? Levels for each of a series of things. So mental, emotional, and behavioral. Take, for example, the concept of love. the notion that loving is part of a prescription for how to live a theosophical life. How is that expressed in behavior? Well, it's expressed in something like kindness or generosity. How is it expressed emotionally? Well, certainly, most of us would use the word love for the emotional side of it. At the mental level, we thought perhaps the expression of that was unity, a sense of oneness. Now, but what's the flip side of that? Or if one doesn't like to call it negative, which we eventually cast out, what does the absence of love look like in behavior, in thought, and in emotion? In behavior, cruelty, hurtful actions of various kinds. At the emotional level, anger, and perhaps impatience. And at the mental level, thoughtlessness, selfishness. Now, one can do this with a whole series of concepts like love. Cheerfulness, let me just give you one other. Let me see if that's the one I want to do. Yeah. Let us take cheerfulness as a goal. This is one of the things that Krishnamurti talks about in At the Feet of the Master, and that it is described in many other books about preparation, if you will, for the path of enlightenment. Let's try cheerfulness. Now, we thought that was at the emotional level, so let's put that in here. At the mental level, that struck us as being optimism. At the behavioral level, I was warned about that, laughter, affection, and the absence of it produces a kind of preoccupation with the self. At the mental level, depression. At the emotional level, and at the physical behavior level, there's various kinds of depressed behavior that you get, such as gloomy looks, lots of body language stuff that indicates a lack of cheerfulness. That, you know, I'm sure you've all, if you're around someone who's depressed, it's terribly contagious. It's hard to be cheerful around, and it's partly that there's all this body language. It's also that at the emotional and the mental level, there are all kinds of other things being radiated. What we did was to take, as a group, one column of this each month, and we argued about it. Did it, was that really right? And how did it apply? And we talked about specific cases, and then everybody went home and tried it for a month. Worked on that particular quality in all of its manifestations, at the mental level, at the emotional level, at the physical, behavioral level, and observed ourselves when we behaved or thought or felt in ways that expressed the lack of that. That is, observed ourselves when we seemed to be showing any of these characteristics, to see when it happened, why it happened, and then talked about how one might get around that. So we talked about some of this same model, and then we made a series of agreements about things we would do during the week. Let me read you some of these agreements. It provoked all kinds of wonderful arguments. I agree to perform one kindly or loving act for another person each day, preferably anonymously. Hard to do, by the way, in a small community. The anonymously part, not the kind or loving act. I agree to spend at least 10 minutes a day generating caring or loving thoughts for or about some other person or persons. I agree not to grumble or whine about people or situations, and if I do, I will ask myself why. I agree not to speak of another person unkindly, unnecessarily, or untruthfully. That one has to do with gossip. And I have to tell you, that is the hardest one. And if you get down to this level of specificity, it is almost impossible to stop talking about people. Krishnamurti in this book says at one point, and it's echoed in a variety of other places, that you should think before you speak anything, and ask yourself whether what you are about to say is true, helpful, and kind. And if it is not, you should not speak it. True, helpful, and kind. Now, if one followed that dictum, there would be a great deal of silence. In fact, mostly silence. Because if you think about your own conversation, what do we talk about with each other? We talk about other people. Now, talking about yourself or talking about the person you're with is something else again. But even so, you have to ask yourself, is it true, is it helpful, is it kind? And that one was the one that provoked the biggest argument, and about which the people which all of us had the greatest difficulty. Everybody carried around little notebooks and kept track of things, encounters that they had where they had difficulty, or where they observed themselves and could see various emotions or thoughts or behaviors passing along, and tried to understand. Now, I should tell you about these exercises that they were very interesting and helpful. Everyone reported that when they specifically set out to try to do something kind every day, one kind act a day, that's not a very demanding standard, right? But when they consciously set out with the intent to do something kind every day, that pretty soon they found they felt better. Particularly about the person for whom they had done something kind. And this matches my own observation. I discovered some years ago, when I began to do a specific kind of long-distance healing meditation every day, that if I could bring myself to include in this meditation whatever person I was having the most trouble with in my life at that time, that after a while I stopped having so much trouble with that person. That the act of simply thinking of them with compassion and care every day changed my relationship with them. It wasn't that the change in the relationship came first and then I was able to think kindly of them, but the reverse also occurred. And that I found very interesting, because it said to me that sometimes my behavior can lead me, even when I'm not sure about the motive, which I want to come back to. It was a very interesting exercise, and one that you might find helpful with whatever set of specific prescriptions you might find in your own life, whatever your code may be. You certainly don't have to arrive at the same ones necessarily that I did. But at this time, my need was for something very concrete, and I was convinced that these very concrete things were absolutely the essence of theosophical ethics, and if I could just do it, I'd have it. Well, the trouble was that this whole exercise not only taught me that there is some of that effect, that the doing of it affects the feeling and the thinking and makes me a different person, but it also taught me, and every one of us who was involved in this exercise, that there is no absolute behavior. You cannot point to a behavior and say it's always good or always bad. There is no such thing. And that the motive is really the crucial thing. It is at the emotional and the mental level that the real ethical problem lies. That the behavior largely, not always, one can override this, but as a general rule, it is the motive that matters. And you will find this in many of the theosophical writings, that the motive is everything. That what determines the rightness or wrongness of a given action is the intent of the actor, and not the action itself. And that in essence, any action may be good or bad, depending on that motive. If you help someone, whatever, they ask for help on their term paper, or they need to borrow money, or they ask you to drive them to the hospital, or any kind of action. If you help them because you're acting out of genuine compassion or caring, that's one kind of helping. But if you watch your own motives when you're doing these things, what you discover is that there's all kinds of other murky, muddy stuff in there. Like you really are helping them partly because you want them to owe you one, or you want them to like you, or you're afraid that if you don't, something unpleasant will happen. They won't approve of you, or you won't like yourself, which is a little subtler version of the same thing. That is, suppose you have decided that it is good to be good and helpful. So you act in that way not because you feel particularly kind or generous toward this person, but because you've decided it's a good thing to do. Even though that may, in the end, change the way you feel about that individual and eventually help you to feel genuinely compassionate, the initial motive may be only to be a good person. And that is just as self-centered a motive as many of the others. So the motive just gets plain tricky. And the more we explored this, the more it became clear to me that I could not write a set of prescriptions. That is not to say that these are not helpful. I still find them helpful, as I'll come back to in a bit. But it just became clear that I was looking, how can I put it, at the wrong level. That there was something else here that I was not really dealing with at all. And that led me back into reading a rather different source and led me to a kind of relativism, which I have been grappling with more recently. I'm a concrete person. I like things laid out tidily. So for me to get fuzzy and relativist in morality was a fairly good-sized leap. And I think it upsets a lot of people to think that Theosophy doesn't tell you what to do. Well, why doesn't it tell you what to do? We say instead everyone must find his or her own path. And that is profoundly disturbing to people because they say, well, where is it? Tell me how to do it. And I used to tell people how to do it. I thought I knew. And then I came to the point where I didn't know anymore. And then there's another stage which I'll tell you about where I thought I knew again, and I think I may be back to the I don't know. But at the moment I'll tell you the second step, which was I'm not sure. I ended up going back and reading some of the relativist answers, and let me give you some quotes from some fairly recent writings of this ilk. The first is from John Algeo, whom some of you may have heard speak. Was it just last Sunday? Yeah. Very eloquent speaker and writer. And he says, specifically on the question of theosophical ethics, he says, Theosophy offers no list of commandments, no set of instructions about what people should or should not do. Any such list would only lead to sterile arguments about the letter of the law and to holier-than-thou attitudes, which are the very antithesis of brotherhood. Now, I might beg to differ with John Algeo because certainly there are books contained within the theosophical literature, such as the one from which I have been quoting, and many by Bishop Leadbeater, particularly the one that I found useful, book called The Inner Life. There are lots of books around that give you nice, tidy little lists. So it's not altogether true that there are no such lists within Theosophy. But what John is saying is that Theosophy, capital T, that the essential philosophy does not offer such commandments. And he goes on to say that the basis of theosophical ethics is the practice of brotherhood, which is an inevitable consequence of the radical oneness of all life. Each must discover for himself or herself what is right. And further he says, developing right action in a particular circumstance involves development of discrimination and desirelessness, familiar terms, which are in turn developed by the practice of choiceless awareness, which in turn requires an understanding of oneself. So you keep pushing it backwards, and what you come to is that ethical action begins with self-understanding. Renee Weber, another speaker some of you may have heard because she's spoken here many times. She's a professor of philosophy at Rutgers, so ethics really is her field. She says, the essence of theosophical ethics is not rules, but an inner attitude that can irradiate our lives. And goes on to argue that theosophical ethics requires, and at the same time are created by, required and created by, study, meditation, and service, which are the three hallmarks often given of living a theosophical life, and which 10 years ago I thought were appallingly fuzzy. Thus again, it is self-understanding which is said to be the key. Meditation is part of this. It is a kind of prescription. She's saying what to do. She says meditate, study, service. Meditate so that each of us may experience directly that inner light which may irradiate our lives. Study so that we may understand ourselves and the nature of the universe. And service because the very purpose of the Theosophical Society from the beginning was to serve our fellow human beings in their individual spiritual journeys. The very founding of this society was based on a commitment to service to humanity. Now, when you think about this point of view is as clearly true as the more prescriptive one. Now, this is a different kind of prescription. It says, know thyself, and from that knowledge will come action. That seems clearly true to me also. But to me, caught in all of this, there is a kind of paradox. If you go back to that statement of Madame Blavatsky's that I read at the very beginning, lead the life if you would come to the wisdom. What is the statement that comes first? Lead the life, and then you will come to the wisdom. And that seems to say, figure out how to live, and then that will open the door to the knowledge. What Rene Weber, what John Algeo, and others who talk about a kind of relativistic theosophical ethics are doing is turning it exactly on its head. They are saying, come to the wisdom if you would lead the life. That leading the life flows from the knowing and not the other way around. Now, I would submit to you, and this is my current position, come back in another 10 years, I may be saying something different. I would submit to you that both of those are true simultaneously, and that to live a theosophical life, to deal with the everyday moral and ethical questions, requires both of those attitudes simultaneously. That the solution to paradox, in my experience, is nearly always to understand how both things can be true at the same time. And I'm not sure I've got this one nailed down yet, but it seems to me at one level it is possible to follow both sets of prescriptions as follows. Yes, of course you must come to understanding of yourself. And meditation, study, and service are noble ways to do so. They're not the only ways. I happen to believe that certain kinds of therapy are very useful ways of coming to know yourself as well. There are many ways to come to that illumination. Theosophy offers roadmaps, offers insights from many scholars, from many teachers through millennia about how one might do that. But there are zillions of kinds of meditation, and each one of us must decide for ourselves which one is the better path for us. So yes, all of that is true, that self-understanding must be a part, that opening of that window so that the light may shine through is certainly a part of the process, because only when that light is shining through is the motive for our action pure. Is it selfless? And there's irony in that, because it seems to say, take what seems on some sense to be a selfish action, that is to be preoccupied with oneself, in order to achieve selflessness. But I find that only to do that doesn't get me through the day. It doesn't tell me enough about how to act on a day-to-day basis. If I wait until my motive is pure, I mean, shoot, when do I start helping people? When do I begin anyway to go ahead and do it? Even though I watch myself and I see, yeah, that's true. Part of me is doing this because I want everybody to think I'm just such a swell and holy person. Yes, that's true. I can see that very clearly. I'm aware, for example, that when I do therapeutic touch, which is a form of healing with which some of you may be familiar, which I think there's a group here that does therapeutic touch. I'm aware that when I do that, there is often a part of me that is watching and saying, gosh, isn't that neat? Isn't she impressive? Look at her doing all those helpful things. And there's a part of me that's there, that's off watching, being pleased with myself. And there's a part of me that's not. There's a part in which the window is open and it's all just right there and sort of pure compassion comes through. If I waited until it was only the second of those before I tried it, I could wait a long time. I mean, there's no guarantee that in this lifetime I'm going to get there. I could try, but to wait until the motive is pure seems to me to be wasting an awful lot of time. So it seems that, to me, that simultaneously one needs not only to work toward that illumination from which ethical action flows automatically, but one needs to go ahead and behave anyway, to do the best one can. Impure though it may be, full of inconsistencies, full of selfishness as it is. And it is here that my experience with these experiments comes back to aid me, because my experience was very much that as I acted, it changed me. It was not just that I did something that on the face of it looked nice for someone else, although I certainly have tried to do that. But that act itself fed back into my self-awareness. So the third piece, first piece is all of that study, meditation, and service that allows one to know oneself by whatever technique, and there are many. The second is just to go ahead and follow these prescriptions or some other, the best one can. And the third piece is to watch, to observe yourself in the process of acting and feeling and thinking in each moment. To be aware of the complexity of the motive, to be aware and laugh at yourself when you come upon these, we're all really pretty funny about all of this, all of these incredibly mixed motives, the sort of secret, sneaky way in which self-aggrandizement creeps in to actions that otherwise look just incredibly kind and generous. To watch all that, not judgmentally, just to be aware. And it then works like what psychologists and others in communications call a feedback loop. So that the more you understand of yourself, the more you meditate, the more clear you become, the easier it is to act from the heart. The more you behave as if you were acting from your heart, the more open you become to the meditation, to the study. So that the system operates both ways. You don't have to start at one end only. You can start at both ends. But the key for me is that observation, that awareness of the process as it is going on. And it's from that I learn. I do think actually that acting as if your motive were pure is itself a very large step in the right direction. Without saying, oh, what a terrible person I am because I can't seem to do this without wanting something for myself. Just saying, okay, this is the best I can do at the moment. Sure, part of me wants a little praise for visiting my sick friend at the hospital every day. I mean, isn't that impressive? And certainly I do find the opportunity to drop into the conversation. Well, yes, I did go see Vera again today, so that everyone can admire the fact that I've been going every day. But Vera, who is in the hospital, who is in fact a friend of mine, Vera, who is in the hospital, is delighted to see me every day, and I am pleased to see her, and I sit and hold her hand, and what happens between us is from the heart. So there's a piece of it there, even though partly I'm doing it because I want to feel good about myself, and I want other people to admire me, and I'm aware of both of those motives. And I watch those motives, and as I watch, I'm able to laugh at them, and that loosens the grip a bit of those funny selfishnesses that we all have. So all three of those pieces, it seems to me, help one to move toward a daily life, which it becomes, by very small increments, more richly lived from that quiet place within each of us from which love flows sort of uncomplicatedly forward. Now then that leads me, let me give you after all of that, to a very wordy definition of theosophical ethics. I'm sure there's a shorter version of this, so this is the closest I can get at the moment. My present definition of theosophical ethics is the intent to behave, think, and feel in those compassionate and loving ways that reflect one's own highest awareness of the fundamental unity of all life and the pursuit of ever deeper awareness through meditation, study, and service. I haven't got the feedback loop into that definition yet. I haven't figured out how to get it in there. But I want to emphasize that each of, just as the definition I read earlier, the most relativistic definition says everybody's got to do it at whatever level they are, and I agree with that. But I do think you do not have to throw out all of the lessons that other people have learned about the kinds of behaviors and thoughts and feelings that are part of, that are displayed by someone who is indeed acting from the heart. So that by copying that, we too acquire a little of that, maybe a small amount, but it does feed back into the system. I offer that to you as my own present groping toward some idea of how one might live a theosophical life.